BBC Radio Cambridgeshire.
29 minutes to 1 here on Lunchtime Live with me, Jeremy Sallis. And my guest today is research biologist, author, lecturer and broadcaster, Professor Brian J. Ford. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Well, hello. It is afternoon already.
It is. I'm surprised you found time for us because you are an incredibly busy man. You've attracted attention in the press just recently, linked to your obsession with the earliest ever microscopes.
Well, isn't that amazing? When I was at school, at the King's School in Peterborough, we had a chap called A.G. Lowndes who came from the Marine Biological Research Station in Plymouth for a year to teach us science. And he used to have private classes with me on a Thursday night. And one day he was teaching me all about the man who first saw the microscopic world, the first person to see microbes, which was in 1674. Now, can you imagine what that was like? About the same time they were making telescopes, but we already knew there were stars in the sky. And telescopes let you see more of them and bigger and better. But nobody realised that there was this incredible universe of living things that you couldn't see with the naked eye. And this man, who was a draper and a town official in Delft in Holland, Antonie van Leeuwenhoek, he was the first person to suddenly look at lake water and see it filled with all these microbes. And he said that he sat there with his mouth open for hours just watching in amazement. It had never been seen before. And one of the things that Lowndes told me was that he'd made lots of little microscopes. They were tiny. They were the size of a postage stamp with a little screw on to hold the specimen, and a single little lens about as big as the head of a normal pin. And he told me how the Royal Society had been given a collection of them when Leeuwenhoek died, and how other people had them too, but they'd all gone missing. And I said to him, I'd have been 14, 15 at the time, I said, wouldn't it be fun to find Leeuwenhoek's microscopes? Well, in 1981, I had the immense good fortune to discover Leeuwenhoek's specimens, because he actually cut specimens, sections of things, and he sent them to London, and they'd been languishing in the Royal Society and never looked at for over 3 centuries. And within the last year, and I regularly get people saying, oh, look, I found a genuine microscope, and it's always a fake. But within the last year, 2 real ones have landed on my desk. And I find it extraordinary to think that here I am, an ageing academic, 76 years old. I was interested in this before I was 16. So there's 50 years of clear space. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen, thinking to myself, this is utterly amazing. I've actually got knowledge of 2 Leeuwenhoek microscopes made about 1690, and both have just come to light in the same year. I really can't believe it.
And dredged from the Dutch silt.
Well, the last one that was sold from public hands was in 2009 at Christie's in London, little silver microscope, and that sold for $500,000. So they're serious money. And then another one came up a year ago, just over a year ago. It was brought into Christie's by I think it was a silver dealer who had all sorts of little oddments, including a little box of bits that the kids used to play with. And one of them turned out to be a Leeuwenhoek microscope, and Christie's sold it privately to a collector and property developer in the Netherlands called Bert Degenaar. He then flew over to Cambridge and came to spend the day, and we could have a chat and discuss his find. But then last December, this is so much a story of our times, last December, one was dredged out of the mud from the canal in Delft where Leeuwenhoek lived, and it was advertised with some other stuff that metal detectorists had found on eBay, of all places, and it was going for $90. And suddenly it disappeared, and it turned out it was bought by one of Spain's top clinical research scientists, a toxicologist, Dr. Tomás Camacho. And Camacho sent me an email, and he said, I'm going to send this over. And it came the next day by courier, this incredible little microscope. It just arrived by courier, like something in the post. I said, don't send it like that. Take it in your pocket. Anyway, we've been working on it now for 5 months and looking at the fine details of how it was made. Out at the Cavendish laboratory, Professor Richard Langford, who is an extraordinarily wide-ranging research scientist, he's in charge of the scanning electron microscope suite. And my colleague, John Rickard, JJ Rickard, JJ's a great chap. He knows how these microscopes work, and he can do all sorts of things with them. And whenever something really interesting comes up, we get together and have a look to see what we could find, because it struck me that the best way to tell whether these are actually genuine is to look at the tiniest details that you can't see with a normal lens. You won't see with the naked eye. You have to look through a scanning electron microscope where you can see the minutest little details. So we've been studying for the first time, studying this little microscope with these latest state-of-the-art microscopes to see exactly how it was made. And my idea now, of course, is to look at all the others, because there are about a dozen now microscopes associated with Leeuwenhoek from 340 years ago. And I know that at least one or two of them are certainly not kosher. They are fakes. But you can't really... It's like an old master, Jeremy. You know, you look at it and think, oh yes, I'm certain that this was certainly painted by Van Gogh. Absolutely no question about it. And later it turns out it was just a fake, you know. It isn't enough to just look at these things and to say, this looks genuine to me. We've got to have an objective scientific way of doing it. And I think that looking at immensely high power, at the tiniest details of how it was made, that would allow us to say which of these are actually genuine and which ones are actually fake.
So, over 300 years old. Describe to us, if you will, what exactly it looked like. It was a small brass or silver plates?
Yes, he made them usually out of silver. Probably he started off making them out of silver because, of course, it's a soft metal to work with. And then probably moves on to brass. But they're about the size of a rectangular Christmas postage stamp. That's all. Two plates of brass with a little hole drilled through, and his tiny single lens was held between these plates of brass that he riveted together. And then against it he screwed a long screw, a little stage block on it so that he could put his specimens on. And then you'd hold it incredibly close to your eye, and you can actually see microorganisms perfectly plainly with this single tiny lens.
So the images that he was witnessing were as they would be if we were to use a microscope, a sort of low-grade microscope.
Well, that's the leading question, because in fact with most things, you know, if it's a zipper or a car or a biro or a pair of spectacles or anything you want, the modern version is thousands of times better than the very first ones. But in fact, if you take the optical kind of light microscope that you see in a CSI program on somebody's bench, the best image that you'll get from that is only 4 times better than you get from one of these microscopes made more than 340 years ago, which is mind-boggling. Yes, you can see bacteria, you can see chromosomes with these little tiny lenses. It is amazing how powerful they are.
And everyone remembers that first science class at school when you get your chance to look through the very expensive piece of kit. You know, they get the microscope out of the cupboard and you witness an entirely new world, a whole new universe, and it's breathtaking. I can't imagine what it must have been like then for Leeuwenhoek to be the first man to see this entire new world.
You're so right. But you see, the point you've just made is the most interesting one of all, because I've always thought there should be a law that says that no child should get to the age of 10 without having looked at microbes through a microscope, as you did. Because a lot of kids don't these days.
Really?
Some years ago, we gave a digital microscope to every school in Britain through Nesta, and I produced for them a booklet, a colour booklet full of experiments, so that we knew that every school, every state school would have a microscope. Because these days, it's not much in the curriculum. You know, they're teaching kids about DNA and the Large Hadron Collider and all that rubbish. And what they want to do is to have a look through a microscope at living cells, at microbes, and see how life really works. Once you've done what you did, once you've looked at life through a microscope, you never ever look at yourself in the same way again. It explains so much about living, about dying, and about disease, and about health and how the world works.
How did he know, though, that there was anything to look at?
Well, he got his idea from an Englishman called Robert Hooke, who published a book 350 years ago this year called Micrographia. And it was the first book that was devoted to what the world was like under the microscope. It's a big coffee table book, you know, bigger than a sheet of foolscap paper, an 1.5 inches thick. And in it, what Robert Hooke did was to magnify things that people knew about. Didn't have microbes in it much, but he had things like an enormous 2-foot-long flea and a huge headlouse and a gigantic threatening-looking ant, beautifully engraved. I mean, his engravings would pretty well stand up as illustrations in the modern world. But he also said in that book that if you want to see things much, much clearer, then the best thing to do, he said, is to grind a little lens, and he explained exactly how you do it, and mount it into a hole pierced in a plate of metal, And any object brought very close to the other side, and if you squint and look at it, you will see it with much more clarity than you would with a normal microscope. And he said, I don't use them much because they're very troublesome to be used. But Leeuwenhoek came to London, his only visit outside of the Netherlands, the year after this book had been published. And when he went back, he started making experiments exactly with the design that Robert Hooke had laid down. And in 1674, he started sending his observations on the microbe world. But when you think back to how excited you were when you saw things, as you said just now, imagine what he thought. And the reason it came to his attention is that he was going across a lake in Holland called Berkelsee Meer, and they had what we would now call witch's hair, algae, floating in the water. And he said to the boatman, what's all that stuff? And the boatman said, oh, that's called angel dust. He said, the fairies produce it, you know. And Leeuwenhoek thought, well, I'll take some home. So he was interested in these microscopes, so he took some home in a little bottle of water. And when he got home, he found, no, it wasn't any mythical honeydew substance at all. He said, I could just see myriad little microbes. And the way he described them is so good that to this day you can tell what species he was looking at. It really is a breathtaking opening of a huge window into science. And from those observations, in 1674, from those observations, our modern world of cells and microbes and chromosomes and genes and everything else has stemmed. That was the moment when it all began.
Unbelievable. Professor Brian J. Ford, research biologist, author, lecturer and broadcaster based at Cambridge University. It's been an absolute delight this afternoon. Professor Brian J. Ford, thank you so much for joining us.